I'm now speaking with Max Boddy, who's the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party. Now, the Australian government, the coalition in assistance with the Labor Party, have recently put some changes into the Electoral Act where the number of people you need to register a party has increased from 500 people to 1,500 people. So I'm now talking with Max Boddy to get a bit of their perspective on how this came about and what the motivations are about it and what different people are doing about it. I know between the Pirate Party and I think there's a bit of a coalition that I'll talk about another time, we're certainly challenging it in our way. But Max, perhaps you can tell me what's your view of how this legislation came about and what were the motivations behind it?
Well, I think these laws, which are a major assault on the right of so-called minor political parties, but more broadly are a major attack on millions of working people, has been passed because there is, more and more a growing attraction to political alternatives. When people are beginning to see that Labor and Liberal government, or the Liberal National Coalition government and the Labor opposition are essentially two sides of the same coin. They agree and line up on the question of the attacks on social conditions, austerity, the assault on democratic rights, and the drive to war. And so it's under those conditions that these laws, this legislation was passed to muzzle political and social opposition and to try and prevent the hostility that's developing against the two major parties finding political expression with votes for, as they said, so-called minor parties, those without a member in Parliament. I mean, they're also conscious of the fact that in the 2019 election, there was about 25% of people who cast their ballots for parties other than Labor and Liberal. And so this is part of the considerations behind the passing of these anti-democratic laws, which were rushed through Parliament in less than 24 hours with the full support of the Labor opposition.
So when you say rushed through Parliament, so I guess you would have had the independents, other people who perhaps might have challenged it, the crossbenchers. Was there much in the way of discussion about this particular bill while it was going through Parliament?
There was some discussion. There was the Greens who put their position forward that they thought that it wasn't necessary to have 1,500 as the number, that 500, which was part of the previous legislation requirements for electoral for membership to be submitted to the Australian Electoral Commission, was adequate. But even that in itself, these kind of mealy-mouthed criticisms, reveal the kind of orientation of the Greens themselves, given the fact that even that, we've always opposed, that we've, what would you say, begrudgingly given over the 500 members. But that law itself, passed by the Hawke-Keating Labor government in 1984, effectively removed the right of a secret ballot because registered political parties had to hand over this membership list. So there was that opposition as it was going through. But it was, in terms of the mass media, there was essentially a virtual blackout. Many people in Australia do not know that these laws have even come into effect, let alone were tabled and passed.
Okay, because I suppose it's very interesting that you're saying that 25% of electors didn't vote for Labor or Liberal. I imagine a good proportion of them would have voted for the Greens. But I suppose in a way that is quite telling that, the other criticism that has been made, and I know there's Anthony Green who doesn't really want to think about any parties apart from Labor and Liberal. But there have been, I guess people who have been concerned about the large size of the ballot paper. And I do say this is, one of the parties, the Pirate Party, that comes to occupy that large ballot sheet. And, on the one hand, you can appreciate a certain amount of frustration on the part of people, but equally the fact that 25% of people are willing to not vote for a major party, I suppose that's also telling in its way as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular aspect.
Yeah, well, look, if there is opposition to the kind of long ballot paper, take that position to its logical conclusion. Because the ballot paper might be somewhat frustrating to individuals, they then advocate or agree with laws that remove their own democratic rights. That is the right to stand in elections under your own party name. And the fact that there are these numerous other parties is not something that should be seen as something frustrating, but is in fact something that is important in any democratic system, is to have a myriad of political parties fighting for and putting forward, their positions. So I think, one needs to always take, I guess, their conceptions to the logical political conclusion to say, I get a bit frustrated when I vote, therefore it's okay to have anti-democratic measures that attack, not just these minor parties, but one's own basic democratic rights is a very dangerous position to have.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that if people were aware of, I guess, that direct trade-off, that is the, I guess, the consequence of this approach. But I guess another thing that whether it's yourself or your colleagues have been writing about in your articles, I guess you've been writing on the World Socialist website. I mean, one of the things is, I guess, the COVID pandemic has hit us from the blue, but you could equally argue that during this time of lockdowns and limited face-to-face communication, it's going to make it even harder for minor parties to deal with this this increase to 1,500 people, which was difficult anyway. And in light of the COVID pandemic, I suppose I've got a few things to say there, but maybe you want to fill in those comments. I know that at least your colleagues have been making, if not yourself.
I think that's very correct, John. I mean, it's very conscious that these laws were passed under conditions of the pandemic crisis in this country. And, lockdowns in, the most populous state of the country, New South Wales, and I believe the second most populous, Victoria. I mean, it creates the conditions in which minor parties are unable to hold public meetings, are unable to campaign on the streets, to door knock, and to do the essentially normal activities that political parties do to put their positions forward and to win new members, to submit to the AEC. And so it was a very conscious approach. And I think the other side of the coin in this is that some of the hostility towards the major political parties are a direct result of their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, allowing the virus to let rip in a country that had, to a certain degree, essentially eliminated it here, not placing in proper lockdown measures. I mean, in New South Wales, they allowed it to let rip for 10 days before even, they call it lockdown, but it's very limited lockdown measures were put in place. And so this has resulted, I think, in a great amount of anger towards these major parties. And it's that anger that they seek to head off by the passing of this legislation.
Well, certainly, I suppose the thing that I see is that, in a sense, the government has been obliged to do a lot of things differently because there is the COVID pandemic, emergency measures, bypassing some of the usual standards for, medical authorization of vaccines and so on. And please don't get me wrong, this is a trade-off to be made. I sort of actually endorse the government doing that. But I guess the thing that stings in this whole thing is the government's willing to do so many things differently and special because of the COVID pandemic, but they're not willing to recognise the additional impact of the COVID pandemic on laws like this that they're putting into play. And I suppose that's echoing the sentiment that you have expressed there a bit.
Yeah, the truth is these laws also didn't come out of the blue. There's been a series of anti-democratic laws that have been passed in this country that in one form or another target the basic democratic rights of individuals and political parties, including the right to stand, such as the foreign interference legislation that targeted so-called dual citizens, that is individuals that have a citizenship in both Australia and another country. But then even after the electoral laws were passed, I think a week later, you have these mass surveillance laws that were passed. It was amendment to the surveillance legislation, which, essentially allows the various agencies, including the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, to seize control over online accounts, delete, modify that data. I mean, this was an incredible piece of legislation, of anti-democratic authoritarian legislation that was then passed, I think it was just over a week later. So, they are utilising the pandemic to pass these laws with very little discussion being had. But they're passing them, I guess the point is, not from a position of strength, but from profound weakness and fear. Fear that in the developing opposition to these major parties was expressed at the last election, and is also being expressed more and more in different forms throughout the course of this pandemic. So I think those are some of the points that one can raise in regards to that. I mean, the COVID-19 measures, as we've written on, have been inadequate, across the board. I mean, there's a reason that the daily cases in New South Wales still hover around 1,000 or more. That Victoria is now on the rise, is nearly reaching 1,000. I believe in Victoria now, they've reached the highest number since the pandemic began last year. You have a situation in which the interests, that is the profit interests of big business, are dominating the policies of the Australian political establishment in one form or another. Production must continue. Profits must continue to be garnered off the backs of the working class.
I will invite you to elaborate on, I know there's a position that your party has taken that the impacts of the COVID lockdown has fallen disproportionately on the working class. So maybe you've hinted at that, but I'll invite you to just say a little bit more about that particular sentiment.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, one only has to look at the situation, particularly in Sydney, in which it's Western Sydney, that the various working class areas that bear the brunt of the virus, in which families are being, particularly in areas where there are larger households, that is, there are much more people. I mean, some call it also overcrowding in these houses, where the Delta variant, which unlike the wild variant previously, spreads to every individual in the house. One person is forced to go to work. I mean, it's incredible. You live in Western Sydney, they say it's, we're locking it down, but individuals can still work outside of their various LGAs and postcodes, then return home, carrying the virus, infecting their family. Then it's the family members that are passing away, also many of them in their own home, because they aren't able to get the facilities at the hospitals, which are overcrowded now. I mean, one has to say that the situation now in the hospitals is reaching a point of utter breakdown in one form or another. And so, you have working class families that are disproportionately affected. And you see that also in the response by the government, who throw, police on horseback, helicopters. I mean, we've interviewed some individuals who live in these areas who've come from various countries that have, more dictatorial forms of rule. And that reminds them of, military curfews and lockdowns. Whereas when you look over the pond, so to speak, just over a couple of suburbs in the kind of northern shores, you have people on the beach, out getting coffee, many of them maskless. I mean, it's a tale of two cities in Sydney. And that can be expanded also to Western New South Wales, in which, Aboriginal communities now in particular are being, affected very severely, all which was because of previous policies that have left a completely inadequate healthcare system, housing crisis, which exacerbate the situation that face those communities. So in contrast, just to, I guess, make a contrast, between November and June, so November 2020 and June 2021, the billionaires of this country increased their collective wealth by $55 billion. Now they almost have, between the top 200 billionaires, top 200 wealthiest individuals in Australia, they almost have a combined wealth of $500 billion. I mean, that's the divide.
Well, I suppose developing that sentiment somewhat, and it's not, I guess, axe grinding to quite the same degree, but you can recognise that a lot of Labor has been unable to earn its sort of income or sort of its ongoing cash that it wants to either spend on bills or accumulate or whatever. So Labor's been obliged to sort of hold off on that. But capital or asset owners have continued to earn their money. So you can look at that and say, hang on, this is a bit out of whack. If Labor was obliged to basically earn less on a week-to-week basis, then, you know, we should also oblige capital to basically suffer a similar burden themselves in order to share that load around. So that's sort of, I guess, certainly echoing what you're saying, but operating from a slightly different sentiment. But I suppose, obviously, mistakes, I don't know how things have got the way they have in Victoria, but certainly you can look at Berejiklian, who, you know, her administration made the mistakes with the Ruby Princess, and you could say they didn't see that coming. And then she's talking about not seeing Delta coming. But, you know, anyone with a little bit of mathematical nous will be able to say, hang on, a reproduction number of 6 is going to be a lot worse than a reproduction number of 3. And to be fair on Berejiklian, as things became bad and she became aware of it, she did react. But if you had a little bit of mathematical nous, you could have seen it coming. And I suppose that's one criticism of Berejiklian, is that really in that sort of position of authority, you should think about things and basically see things coming. And I mean, I certainly hope the best for Australia as we move forward, but we might have a variant that sort of can get past vaccines. And I think there is experience overseas of nations who had a lot of vaccinations and they've still had outbreaks. So you know, pushing for vaccines it certainly won't hurt, but it's not a magic wand either. And, you know, I think we both agree that Berejiklian is trying to shift the blame. Now that we're here, okay, by all means, let's do what we can with vaccination. But the reason why we're here is because of the mistakes that she made, you know, in particular with the Delta variant, and the fact that the national government didn't run proper quarantine facilities from the start. But, you know, that's sort of echoing some of your sentiments. But I guess we have gone a fair bit away from this particular legislation that's to do with elections and so on. And I suppose, yeah, it is fair to say that the large number of parties does illustrate a dissatisfaction of people with the party system and with the system of government that we see around us at the moment. And, you know, that's on the one hand, all these parties. And I think you've also pointed out that 25% of people didn't vote for Liberal or Labor. So I think, you know, they are some very telling things. But look, on the one hand, I might start to bring things to a close. But Max, look, I will invite you to announce your website, how people can find out more about where you guys are coming from. And you can make a few little closing remarks if you can think of some more things to say as well. So let me invite you to sort of tell us a bit more about your website and maybe make a few closing remarks.
Okay, thanks, John. And I do think that the question of these electoral laws are intimately bound up with the pandemic. So I think the discussion, here is entirely correct, that it's dovetailed into that. I mean, one of the aspects is that while Eva Berejiklian, Morrison, completely supported to the hilt by the Labor opposition, both in New South Wales and across the country, say there's no money for, you know, for full compensation for those who have to work from home, who can't go out to their job, etc. All the while there is, the spriggets have been turned on for businesses and for, you know, the super wealthy. So I think, you know, these laws do have to be seen within that context. I mean, we are the only political party that have led the fight to repeal these laws. I mean, we're saying that they have to be defeated. And part of defeating those laws is to join our party as an electoral member in order for us to remain as a registered political party and our name remain registered on the ballot paper. And I think that the joining of our party is more broad than just the question of these electoral laws in isolation, but have to be seen as a step forward, as a step against the fight against broader anti-democratic laws that have been brought forward by the major political parties in this country, and a step against, you know, the anti-scientific, let the virus rip, let's learn to live with the virus conceptions of the Berejiklian and Morrison government, joined now by Andrews in Labor, and a fight for, you know, a scientific conception of an eradication policy. Let's use public health measures linked with the vaccinations to eliminate the virus completely. So to find out more about our party, you can visit the sep.org.au, that is sep.org.au, to find out about our campaign and join as an electoral member. You can email us at sep@sep.org.au, and to read our coverage, as you've said before, John, they can visit the World Socialist website, which is wsws.org.
Okay, well, all right. Well, look, thank you for that, Max. On the one hand, I wish you the best in maintaining your party registration. Obviously, I'm with the Pirate Party and we'll be doing our best as well. But certainly, if all I did on this radio show was grind the axe about the Pirate Party, it would get a bit dull. So I do thank you for calling in and giving us your perspective on things. That's very much appreciated.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the time.